This is as naked a genocide as we have ever seen. Like it is as naked as the Herero genocide in German Southwest Africa. It is as naked as, the Trail of Tears. It is as naked as Auschwitz. It is as naked as any genocide, as naked as Bosnia. It is as naked as any genocide in history. And people are still trying to tell you that it is midnight at high noon. How's my sound?
It's very good. It's very good.
Okay. Yeah, we're good. Okay.
Okay, you can start. Yeah. Okay. So
Hold
this
on.
we're gonna get going. Cool.
Okay, sounds good.
Good day and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. Today with me is Professor Rudoplh Ware, also known as Butch Ware. Professor, thanks for joining us.
It's really a pleasure to be with you.
Professor, I'm not sure if I should call you Professor Rudoplh, Butch Ware.
My Muslim name is Belal, and so a lot of people I'll be called Dr. Belal, Professor Ware, Butch Ware. All are good names for me.
I think I'm probably gonna mix it up. I'll probably go not intentionally. That's just how my brain works. I'll probably move
Sounds
between
good.
Dr. Bilal and Professor. Professor, we're gonna have quite a long conversation. We're gonna get into your life, some of your upbringing, your role models. We're going to speak about Gaza, obviously, and we're going to speak about the reaction to that and how a lot of this conflict is based in white supremacy, which you are. I mean, I don't think you're an expert in white supremacy as such, but you are a specialist in decolonization and in history and in the history of West Africa. So in many ways, you are. Just a,
And any thinking black man, especially in America, is going to be an expert in white supremacy if they're paying attention. So I can be an expert witness, at least experientially.
Okay, great, fantastic. I'm actually going to do something that's a bit different to how we've conducted these interviews previously. I'm just going to dive straight in to
Sure.
something which I think is going to capture the conversation we're going to try to have. On Instagram on October 11th, this is 4 days after Israel began its assault on Gaza in response to Hamas's attack. At that point, just for context for the audience, already 1,200 Palestinians had been killed and 5,600 were wounded. You wrote this. You wrote, "As black people, we already know that they will kill you as many times as they can. They will kill your spirit, your soul, your heart, and your body. And once that is done, they will kill your name and say that you liked all of it because you're an animal." Can you just unpack that for us, but specifically with Gaza?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the aftermath of the uprising on October 7th, the drumbeat of dehumanization, the preparation for violence. So many of us that have been in tune to anti-imperial resistance for a long time recognize the undeniable signs of an oncoming genocide. And so in that moment, what I really wanted to do more than anything was as a black man, as a historian of Africa, as somebody that's been publicly visible about decolonization, abolition, and a really radical revolutionary racial politics, I wanted to signal, especially to black folk, where we needed to be standing in this moment. As somebody that was raised in the Black radical and revolutionary tradition, I had been taught how to read Palestinian resistance by people like Malcolm, by people like Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, by people like Angela Davis, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison. So I knew, and I also knew that we would see a number of black folk waver, right? LeBron James had already made some kind of insane statement standing with Israel. Floyd Mayweather, likewise. And I understood that people that were not steeped in that tradition, black folk might not understand how to read the moment. So I just wanted to remind all colonized people, but especially my people first, that what we were witnessing was dehumanization, that was designed to justify what was going to become an era-defining genocide. And I saw it then. And I put both hands together, stood on the tallest building that I could find, and screamed. Because I didn't know what else to do except to shout as loudly as possible in the face of an oncoming storm, right? And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said that if you see an injustice, stop it with your hand. If you are not capable of stopping it with your hand, then speak against it with your tongue. And then he said, if you are unable to speak against it with your tongue, and this literally means like if your life is at risk if you speak it against it with your tongue, not, I might be criticized in public, I might be demonized. And I was immediately targeted for by Zionists in the local community. They tried to get me relieved from my position at UC Santa Barbara. To finish the hadith, he said, if you are unable to speak against it with your tongue, then at least turn your heart against it. And that is the least that can be accepted of a person of faith. So I had to speak. And I had to speak, and I've been trying to speak literally every day, since October 7th, to try to rally the resistance and to bring together a unified resistance to this imperialist, hopefully this last gasp of imperialism and white supremacy.
Thanks. But what particularly stands out for me about that your post, and it's just one slide. I mean, I'm just probably quoting about 10% of what was your post. But the part that says they will kill your name and say you liked all of it, that really resonates because at that moment we were all fixated with televisions and everything else, and you were seeing Palestinians being blamed for what was going to be a massive destruction. Just tell us how that works and how that's worked in the history of black suppression in the United States and everywhere.
I think that probably I was paraphrasing a word from Zora Neale Hurston, the great poet, author, anthropologist, who said that if you don't speak your truth, then they will kill you and say that you liked it, right? So the idea for me was that seeing the defamation and the dehumanization that was taking place, it seemed important to signal that we don't only resist the violence, we resist the naming, right? We resist the effort to distort. And if you've looked at what the media coverage has done, it has essentially been like a functional arm of genocide. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I agreed to do this interview, because Middle East Eye is one of few places where you can actually have a conversation that is about realities, right? So we have seen the fourth estate, right? The media, literally functioning as the arm of empire, justifying everything. Do you condemn Hamas as the question that precedes and eclipses all other questions, right? Every effort to humanize hostages taken from the Zionist entity, to give them names and backgrounds and histories, and reducing Palestinian casualties to numbers, to barbarians, to animals. We know this story. As Africans, we know this story. As Black people, we know this story. And I just wanted people to understand that this is a very, very long history of dehumanization that we are, finally coming to terms with in our age, and this is a struggle of our time.
Okay, we're gonna come back to a lot of that, and I mean, you even mentioned that you've been under pressure with your employment and everything else. We'll come back to that because we're going to speak about the student protests, which are now probably unprecedented since the 60s across the USA. But let's first things first. I mean, tell us about yourself. Where did you grow up? What was your upbringing like?
Yeah, I guess this circles back to the question of how to be an informed commentator on white supremacy. So the first of my two hometowns is Washington, D.C. I was born there, raised there in early childhood. The son of a locksmith with a sixth grade education, teenage mother. My mom was 15, pregnant with me, given advice by her high school guidance counselor to abort me before my birth. Entered the world in abject poverty at the very bottom of the American social rung. We never lived at the same street address for a calendar year consecutively, I think until I was 9 years old. So we were moving from, low income housing to staying with relatives.
And was it just you and your mom, or were there siblings as well?
My brother James also with me. My father in the picture for significant portions, but also grappling with like addiction and addiction issues, and then also domestic abuse. So sometimes at a battered women's shelter. So the that family unit, you know, my father, my mother, my brother, and myself, that was the core of my world when I was in DC. My mother literally like I don't know what the word is. I guess you would say kidnapped her own children from my father's residence and moved us to Minneapolis because she was in fear for her life. She knew she was dealing with an abusive drug abuser. You know, God rest his soul, Rudolph Jr. And so then the second of my two hometowns was Minneapolis, Minnesota, where my mom, you know, fled as far as she could, got a fresh start. Also, you know, so growing up on the south side of Minneapolis, there, um, really also like still grappling with serious poverty because now it's just a straightforward single mother household. Oftentimes, you know, my mom working 60 to 70 hours a week just to make sure we ate. Sometimes lights on, sometimes lights off, sometimes food in the cupboards, sometimes no food in the cupboards. Um, that was, you know, my childhood up to my teenage years. When my mother remarried, I got a very, very different glimpse into American society. We moved to suburban Minneapolis. And so for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by white people, which was in and of itself a kind of education. And so I do feel like I've had the opportunity to perceive, you know, or to open a window onto like American society from a number of different vantage points. I mean, quite literally, I grew up in a time where it was not uncommon for, you know, for white kids to use, you know, hard R N word, you know, to your face as a racial slur, and to fight. So I went from an environment where DC in the 80s was 95% black. And suburban Minneapolis was 98% white by my late teenage years. So I feel like I got a very well-rounded perspective. I should also mention actually that the city of Minneapolis and on the south side where we moved, there was a large indigenous population, Native American population. And so some of my closest friends coming up were indigenous. And on my father's side, also, both of his grandmothers were part Native. So I feel like in a lot of ways, you know, and I had to really grapple with like fundamental inequalities from early on. My mother is a white woman, and the way that the world received her and treated her, and the way that the world received and treated my father, despite the fact that they like dealt with a lot of the same, you know, fundamental issues as, you know, teenage parents, it was evident for me to read that. You know, the basic inequalities of race were imprinted upon me at an early age.
What made you, as you're growing up, you're obviously a very deep scholar of history. Why did you decide to start to study history?
Man, it's a great question. I think that the way that I would answer that question is that the study of history really was imposed upon me by Malcolm X, by Elijah Malik Shabazz. And it really, the study of history became part of my own spiritual journey and resistance to white supremacy, my growth in a white supremacist environment. I'll explain what I mean. So I wanted to be two things when I was a kid. I was either going to be an MC or a baseball player, okay? And those were the two things that I was best at, was rapping and throwing a baseball. And I ended up actually getting a college baseball scholarship. I ended up, you know, producing a demo. But the reason why I'm mentioning these things now is that hip hop music in my era was very like conscious and Afrocentric, and there was a lot of discussion of the African past and African history and African identity in the music and in the culture. So the music and the culture was really pushing me towards like an interrogation and a reading of my environment. Hip hop lyrics at that time talked about police brutality. They talked about resistance to the carceral state. They talked about black consciousness. They mentioned names like Steve Biko and Patrice Lumumba. And so there was like this trail of breadcrumbs that was leading me to the history. And at that time, like the most popular garments were like X caps, Malcolm X caps, Denzel Washington starring as Malcolm in the Spike Lee, casting of the autobiography of Malcolm X had brought this to the forefront of people's consciousness. So, long story short, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. I read it cover to cover in one night, okay, and went to school without having slept the next day. And
So
when I got
school,
to the
were
end
you
of
still in
that,
high school, or were you already at
I was
university?
in high school. I
Okay.
was I was a freshman in high school. I was 14 years old.
So basically, you
I
saw the
graduated.
movie, and then you're like, I'm gonna go get the book and read the
I
book.
actually no, I actually read the book before the
Okay.
movie came out in chronological order, but I was just sort of speaking to the culture at the time, and I guess sort of conflating them
Yeah.
in my
No, it's
memory. The
fine. It's
movie
fine.
the movie should probably come out in the early 90s,
Yes, I think it
like
comes out in 91 or 92 because I remember seeing
91 or
this.
92
Yeah.
exactly. So I converted to Islam in 1989, and I converted to Islam after reading the autobiography of Malcolm X cover to cover in one night. Okay, and when I finished that book, I wanted what Malcolm had, so I went to my high school library and I checked out an English translation of the Quran. And I read that cover to cover the next night. And so I had been up for two straight nights. And I remember this vividly. I fell asleep and woke up like in the afternoon. So I missed a whole day of school because I had been up all night, studying. And so two things came together. So firstly, because Malcolm was so honest about how dark some of the places that he had been actually were, that narrative of his spiritual redemption really spoke to me because I had seen some very dark places in my life, right? And for me, the autobiography of Malcolm X remains the most powerful narrative for spiritual redemption that we have written in the English language. Okay. It is, The Pilgrim's Progress or Paradise Lost, trash compared to the autobiography of Malcolm X. I mean, this is, a truly edifying and enlightening story of spiritual redemption. So it led me to Islam. It led me to Quran. I literally took Shahada later that week. Okay. I became Muslim. And then Malcolm said things, and I began researching Malcolm, everything Malcolm ever said, everything that he ever did, right? And Malcolm said things like, if a cat has kittens in an oven, that don't make them biscuits, which sounds cryptic, right? Until you hear him expand. And then he said, you call yourself, show me land on a map. You come from Africa, call yourself an African. If a cat has kittens in an oven, that don't make them biscuits. So what is he saying?
Yeah.
You, diaspora African, claim your past, claim your legacy, study your history. Malcolm also said, he said, of all of the disciplines, history is the most likely to bear fruit for our people. Later on, as like a mature scholar and academic, a student of the history of Islam, a student of the Black radical tradition, I would really meditate, and I've written about this, about how in the Quran itself, God devotes the majority of the word count in that book to telling stories, to history, right? And in Surah Al-Hud, the Quran's 11th chapter, its 120th verse, God says, indeed, all that we relate to you in the tales of the previous prophets, with it we fortify your heart. So there's this primordial function of narrative and of storytelling that is meant to provide a fortification for the heart to lead to internal and external liberation. So it was Malcolm that charted my path to Islam, and Malcolm that charted my path to studying African history.
So I'm just going to put this all in context again. So it sounds
Please.
like this was like happening when you're like 15 years old. So by then you've moved to
15.
suburbia. You're now living in
Yep.
the white world.
It was that very year that we moved to suburbia.
So it was a big year for you. It was like everything. Your
It
life
was.
flipped in many ways, not just from trying to find from a very unstable home to a stable home, but even I guess in terms of psychology and spiritual enlightenment and all of those things. Tell me something. I mean, so clearly you have this deep connection with Malcolm X through history and your life. How do you think Malcolm X would have responded to the events of October 7th and everything
Um,
since?
yeah. Well, I mean, we know how he would have answered the question, do you condemn Hamas? Right? We know how Malcolm would have handled that. I recall a beautiful interview where Malcolm is being asked about the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. And he says, we never equate, the quote unquote violence that is used to resist oppression with the violence that is used to impose it in the first place, right? Another one of my great heroes, Walter Rodney, said there's no moral equivalence between the violence of the colonizer and the violence of of anti-colonial resistance. So we know that Malcolm's response would have been the same response as Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael. It would have been to affirm not only the right to resist, I also said this. I said, to be perfectly honest, colonized and oppressed people have a moral obligation to resist. And this is what I think Malcolm's response would have been if you look at the way that he talked about self-defense. And he said, listen, be courteous, respect everyone, obey the law. But if somebody puts their hands on you, send them to the cemetery. Fannie Lou Hamer, another one of those great black radicals, said, she keeps a shotgun in her bedroom. She said, if any of them white boys want to come try to burn down her house, they never going to write to their mama again. That's what she said. That's what she said. So why am I citing this, kind of black militant resistant tradition, right? The Huey P. Newton tradition, the Black Panther tradition, because ultimately, and this is, I think, a fundamental point of basic morality that's getting lost in this moment, is that if a colonizer, like the Zionist entity, commits an aggressive act of murder and theft, they have committed a moral abomination. But if you permit this, when you have the capacity to resist, you are also guilty of a moral failing. It is not just your right to resist. It is your responsibility to resist, because you can keep harm from reaching the children of Adam and Eve by fighting back. You're not supposed to let people kidnap your children and lock them up interminably. You're not supposed to let people violently abuse and sexually exploit women in your community. You're not supposed to let those things happen if you have the capacity to resist. So I don't think of it as a right to resist. I think of it as a responsibility to resist, except if there are circumstances that make that armed resistance impossible. That's why Muslim scholars throughout time have said that if there's inequality in the rapport de force and the relations of force between two parties, it is okay to sue for peace under those circumstances. But otherwise, even if you are outnumbered 2-1, it is your responsibility to stand and fight. And I think that Malcolm, would have approach things that way, the same way that the Panthers, thought about things in that way, the way that, Stokely Carmichael thought about things in that way.
You mentioned, and this may be getting, I don't think it's controversial, but in response to what you just said, it may be getting a bit controversial, but you mentioned that in the event that there's a power differential, that you need to then sue for peace. It's clear that there's a power differential between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So in that context, and this is definitely not what do you think of condemning Hamas moment? Not at all. But how then do you then interpret Hamas's resistance within that framework?
So you have the option of suing for peace. You are not required to sue for peace, right? You have the option for suing.
Absolutely. I mean, besides that, it's their resistance. It's not my or your resistance.
Exactly. So the first thing that I'll say about this, and I've actually also talked about this on social media, is that Palestinians should resist oppression however Palestinians see fit to resist oppression. What I might think as on the outside of that, right, as somebody that is in solidarity in anti-imperialist struggle, in solidarity in struggle against white supremacy, right, is a secondary question. Now, with respect to the broader philosophical question about how oppressed people resist and how we think about the moral basis of that through the lens of Islam and through the lens of our sacred traditions, my greatest spiritual and intellectual hero in the African tradition, the African Muslim tradition, is Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba of Senegal. So I went to Senegal in 1996 for the first time to really like learn. I learned to speak the Wolof language fluently. I learned French for my research purposes. I lived and immersed myself in a West African society, and I've never been in Senegal. I go back and forth all the time. Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba was one of the people who wrote legal opinions during the colonial period in the 1890s, saying that because of the European capacity to inflict casualties on such a massive scale and your inability to respond in kind, that it is morally questionable, if not reprehensible, to take up arms. So if you think back to these kind of colonial moments, like another one is when the forces of Muhammad al-Mahdi in Sudan rally all of the resistance in Sudan against British occupation. There's a battle, it should be mid-September 1898, the Battle of Durman, okay?
You know, that's hilarious. Sorry to interrupt you, but the way you thought, I thought you'd be like somewhere in the 18th century, but then you got so specific, just in terms of...
Yeah, I think, I'm pretty sure it's September 15th, 1898.
There we go.
So there's a battle between the forces of the Sudanese Mahdi and the British occupying forces, okay? And on that day, at that Battle of Durman, the forces of the Mahdi suffered 20,000 casualties. 12,000 of those casualties are suffered between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. that morning. Okay, just in that short a span of time. Now, the British occupying forces suffered 272 casualties. All but about 20 of them are from the Egyptian auxiliaries that are actually holding the rifles. Only a handful, a couple of dozen British officers are even wounded at that battle. So if the casualties inflicted on the resistance number over 20,000, and the casualties inflicted on the actual colonizer are a couple of dozen, then it becomes obvious, like almost literally, that the Islamic interdiction of suicide would dictate that you not continue to throw your children away in a resistance of this kind, because you're literally just condemning them to death. But Muslim scholars like Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, right, in Algeria in the 1830s, he's crowned as the greatest living Sufi thinker in the tradition of Ibn Arabi. When he's 19 years old, he's literally given a turban to symbolize this title. And then at age 20, he's leading the Algerian resistance to French occupation. And this was a man of peace, but who understood that there was an obligation to resist and to fight back. And then people like Ahmadou Bamba, 60, 70 years later, when the power relations are so distinctly different, are also in the right to make a moral argument that under these specific circumstances, that armed resistance is counterproductive and therefore not morally justifiable. And both positions can be defended depending upon how you read the circumstances and the context, which also takes us back to the basic question, like Hamas needs to decide, Palestinians need to decide what the best way to fight back is. And the last thing I'm going to say about that is that whatever you might think about how to weigh that moral question regarding resistance, it is absolutely clear that the October 7th uprising has undone 70 years of Zionist propaganda in 6 months. It has done, through armed resistance, what negotiations and political commentary and voting and liberal hand-wringing had not done in a span of decades. Okay, it revealed the fundamental nature of what Zionism is as settler colonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy, and now the whole world is on fire with resistance.
Professor, I recall again when a lot of the world was involved in I mean, to say doom scrolling also sounds horrible, because while we doom scrolling, people are being killed. But we were involved in a lot of doom scrolling, and many of us still are. But from again, the things that I remember from your Instagram account were specifically, this is in the first month, this is like in October itself, equating a lot of the Israeli response to the response of white supremacists, suppressing
Yes.
slave revolts, and really just trying to punish as much as they can
Yes.
the
Exemplary
non-white body.
violence.
Just speak to us a bit about that, and how perhaps it's led to how white-centric people, or people centered by whiteness, they're ambivalent towards this violence to some degree, and if not supportive of it.
Okay.
Just run us through that.
It's an excellent question, and you may need to give it back to me to reframe it
Please do.
after I give the historical context, because I want to give like just one quick piece of historical context that connects with previous stuff. So literally repeat the question to me if I get too far into the historical context.
Okay, no
So the
worries.
first thing that I want to say is that in 2021, um, I literally started the hashtag Zionism is white supremacy in 2021 with that particular bombing of Gaza, in conversation with like Laura Alborno, human rights lawyer known as Gazan Girl on the internet, close friend of mine, Anwar Hadid, whose sisters were viciously attacked in public. Bella and Gigi for their pro-Palestinian statements. And at that time, in the aftermath of the Floyd uprisings, before Palestine was the center of, anti-colonial resistance that it is now, I was saying Zionism is white supremacy. Okay. And the reason that I was saying Zionism is white supremacy is because Malcolm, my hero, my role model, my guide, had literally said in his notebooks, unpublished notebooks, he said, white European population, this is about Israel, white European population being given a land by white imperialist powers to dispossess Arabs of color from their indigenous lands. This is white supremacy. Okay. He said in an interview at Berkeley, y'all gave all of those white Jews those Arabs land, right? Which is true. It's important to understand that this is an Ashkenazi movement, an Ashkenazi imperialist movement that is coddled and formulated under the auspices of the British Empire. And then after World War II, we, in the United States of America, become its most important patron. But its founders, people like Theodore Herzl, people like Jabotinsky, people like Ruppin, they were explicitly white supremacists. They were explicitly European civilizational chauvinists. They wanted settler colonies, and they tried to get settler colonies in Madagascar and Uganda before they settled on Palestine. The Black radical tradition told me how to read this as white supremacy. James Baldwin had said, the state of Israel was not created for the salvation of the Jews. It was created for the salvation of Western interests. This has always been apparent to me. So now, to respond directly to your question, I'm reading Zionism as white supremacy from the beginning. So if I understand that this is an iteration of a fundamental illness that has plagued humanity for 5 centuries, that was pioneered right on the flesh of my ancestors, both African and indigenous, then I'm going to pursue the analogies that allow me to read the situation for what it is. So and that was part of why I knew a genocide was coming, because in the aftermath of every slave rebellion, there is exemplary violence to put down the uprising, because there's something in the psychology of the colonizer that parity, right? In the international law community and kind of military experts, talk about when you retaliate, that it has to be commensurate, right? You don't want to escalate the situation. There's supposed to be some kind of appropriate response in terms of the application of force. Well, those rules don't apply for white supremacists. The whole point is that if you acknowledge parity between the colonizer and the colonized, then your thesis of the superiority of the colonizer collapses. Therefore, you must punish them with a scale of violence that mocks the scale of violence of the resistance. It has to be humiliation. If there is an uprising of a dozen enslaved people, you have to hang 300 from trees and leave their bodies there so that everybody sees what happens to them. Because the idea is, yes, you are trying to cow resistance. You are trying to brutalize people so thoroughly that they lose the will to fight back. But more importantly, you are scratching a deep-seated psychological itch inside the colonizer's own soul, which is that we have to keep our foot on these people's necks. We must punish them for the temerity of thinking that they have the same rights to freedom that we have. And that is always the response. That was the response to Nat Turner's rebellion. I later heard that after I made that reel about exemplary violence, that the great professor
Norman Finkelstein. Yeah, I wanted to beat you to it because my mind, in a way, I thought, hey, I think he's using Butchware's argument.
No. It turns out that quite literally he had made the same argument initially, maybe 2 days before I made that post. I hadn't seen his argument.
Great minds.
Well, and resistance minds, right? Because what did Finkelstein say about this? He said that October 7th caught him without his principal mentor morally in terms of anti-Zionist resistance, Noam Chomsky. So he had to look for his own moral center and didn't know how to respond because, right, we were lied to and we were told all these crazy things happen. And you can imagine, even as an anti-Zionist Jew, you're gonna sort of have this seizure response because they're trying to portray this as the Twin Towers falling, right? So, but he's quiet in that moment, and then he says that because he had to look inside himself, he looked to what? To history, and he went back. And he went back to William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionist leader in the 1830s. And how did Garrison respond to Nat Turner's rebellion? And he said that Garrison's response was first to not condemn the resistance. The thing that they said was, I told you so. We told you that this was coming. So if Garrison can liken himself if Finkelstein can liken himself to William Lloyd Garrison in that equation, then I'm going to have the audacity to liken myself to Frederick Douglass in that moment. We do not condemn resistance. Nat Turner is right to fight back. And if you understand what you're struggling against, then you understand that you need Garrisons in the resistance movement. You need Frederick Douglasses who fight with their pen, and you also need Nat Turner and John Browns, because let's not also forget that there were white abolitionists that were willing to lay down their lives in the service of liberation as well.
Okay, so there's a part of the question I asked, which was now a long time ago, which kind of got a bit lost.
Circle back.
So on the ambivalence part, this ambivalence of support for many people who wouldn't identify themselves as white supremacist, but what does this say about the ambivalence among people who are, and it's not just white people who are ambivalent.
No.
So where does that leave the ambivalent crowd?
So this is going to be a bitter pill for some people to swallow. But the truth of the matter is that not all white supremacists are white, and many of us have internalized the civilizational and moral scales of our oppressors. We simply suffer more internally when we see white people die. We don't realize it, but there was a reason why the world responded to Ukraine in a particular kind of way that they didn't respond to Palestine in 2021. So all I'm going to say about this is that liberals, especially, will always glorify past resistance, and they will always equivocate on current resistance, because it's uncomfortable. We have told ourselves these bedtime stories that, people like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela changed the world through nonviolent resistance. Okay. But the simple fact of the matter is that nonviolent resistance is one set of tools in the toolkit of reformers and resistors, and that armed struggle against colonial occupiers has always been an important part of anti-colonial liberation. It was fundamental in Mozambique. It was fundamental in Angola. It was fundamental throughout the African continent. It was fundamental in Algeria. And sometimes circumstances permit you to resist with purely nonviolent means. Sometimes circumstances required you to resist with purely nonviolent means. But the simple fact of the matter is that your obligation is to get your people free.
I mean, Mandela wasn't as peaceful as I'm
No,
sure
of
you
course.
know. I mean,
And I should mention, you asked biographical questions. I think that it was probably watching Mandela on Ted Koppel talking about Palestine when I was like 14 that really, like, for the first time, like, I started to understand the relationship between the anti-apartheid marching that we were doing at that time, and the Palestinian struggle. Like, these are revolutionaries, and they stood up for other revolutionaries. People like Hassan Khanafani, and the armed, resistance of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Shoot, Wu-Tang. When I was in my teen years, Wu-Tang was walking, rapping about PLO style. Like, they were talking about Palestine Liberation Organization style. So we should honor, resistance fighters. It makes some people uncomfortable, and it's not up to us. And it's an important part of how people have gotten free historically.
Yeah, no, just on the Mandela point, I think, I mean, besides the fact that he founded the military resistance of the ANC's, the white government in South Africa, but as recent as, I think, the clip's 1998, and it's been circulating all over social media, you've probably seen it, where he's literally standing very close to Yasser Arafat, and he says that, peace is a great way to move ahead, but if that option isn't available to you, then you should fight. And this is Mandela, who's negotiated the peace of South Africa and is now embraced as a peaceful person, and that's consistent because yes, how else will one be free? I now want to move, and I mean, I'm going to do this. We're gonna go through some of your Instagram posts, and when I'm going to contextualize them, because obviously the last 6 months seem, it's difficult to follow. So this is something you posted a bit more recently. It was on March 2nd. By then, just for the audience and for you, the death toll was 30,034, according to most accounts. And this is what it says. This is what it's multiple slides. I'm just reading one slide. I'll read this slide, and then there's another slide in the same tweet, in the same Instagram post, which I'll read later. It says, okay. Humanity's apex predator has perfected the hunting method of the female of its genus. White supremacists, whether light of skin or not, respond with overwhelming force and brutality, ever ready to shed blood whenever she sheds tears. Unpack that for us.
Yeah, I mean, that one is going back to the same, capacity to read things in the context of the history of white supremacy. So I knew that the sexual assault and rape allegations were going to be fraudulent when they were first proffered. Okay, I didn't need to wait for Anat Schwartz to be unmasked and outed as a former IDF Hasbara agent. I didn't need that, and the reason why I didn't need it is that rape allegations preceded almost every single mass lynching in the history of the U.S. South. That the way that white womanhood has been weaponized in order to justify sociopathic brutality against people of color, that is so legible to me that it didn't need interpreting. There's no hieroglyphs, there's no symbols that need to be read. It's like literally just written in capital letters that this is a rationale for a lynching, and it serves no other purpose. So I was not surprised. And I said in other places and in other times that white women's tears are more precious than brown and black people's blood. It hurts this society more to see a white woman's tears hit the ground than to see our blood hit the ground. And the tears, the crocodile tears, so often, the fake tears, the phony tears, claiming to feel afraid, right? Whether it's behind allegations of sexual violence or just saying, I'm afraid. So therefore repress, brutalize, hurt these people, lock them up, protect my feelings. I want to feel safe. I understand how white safety, and especially white feminine safety, has been manipulated and weaponized in order to like take the lives of people of color. So I don't know what more there is to unpack. Like that is the read for me. And it was transparent, you know. And let me just say this also on that particular point. I think it's incredibly important for people in the Palestinian, the pro-Palestinian community, you know, the anti-Zionist community, to really educate themselves on the history of white supremacy and its tactics and its modalities of movement. There's this tendency for us to approach our struggles through these individual silos. And it's like, yeah, I get it. You know, like Zionism, a little over 100 years old, State of Israel, you know, 75, you know, plus years old. But trust me when I tell you that this is the same toolkit that's been rolled out for the last 500 years. Come get some of these lessons that were imposed and, you know, literally inscribed in our flesh and on our bones, right? You know, you think about people like Emmett Till, lynched for, you know, for supposedly looking funny at a white woman. Like, you understand, you know, what's going on. And it's the reason why all of these Zionists, it's the first thing that they go to, right? You see these videos of confrontations on campus, and I hope well, they've been doing that. The thing is it's always projection, right? Is that a lot of African Americans are my skin color because of the number of slave owners, right, that sexually violated the enslaved. And they're always accusing you of doing the thing that they have been doing to you. It's always projection and it's always confession. That is something that is deeply internalized in the psychology of white supremacy itself. And if you know how white supremacist psychology works, if you've read Fanon, if you've read the Black radical tradition, then you're like, oh yeah, I can read this. I see what's going on.
I mean, it's almost like an anthropology of violence across the board of sorts. Then in the same post, this is closer to the end, you say, and this is a different tone, even though it's the same post. But make no mistake, white supremacy's days at the top of the food chain are numbered. Predators once hunted under cover of obscurity. Now our phones record their deception. Some institutions divest while others repress, and those of us that are struggling for freedom are watching closely and keeping account. So this is before, already there were college sort of protests happening, but it's before the furor that's occurred in the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Since the Columbia encampment led to, you know,
Yes.
the chain reaction of encampments across the country. Yes, this was a while back. Yeah.
Why do you think that white supremacy is on the decline, and why? And I'm guessing it's a lot deeper than the fact that, although while it's very important, that the atrocities are being recorded on the phone. I mean, I'm guessing there's a longer answer than that.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm looking at my own screen, and the top shelf of books over my shoulder are Quran commentaries written by a couple of different West African scholars. So the first part of my answer comes from the Quran and from the exegetical tradition of West Africa. And this is just simply to say that our sacred tradition, and indeed actually all sacred traditions, all faiths and philosophies, teach us that temporal power is fleeting and all empires fall. All empires fall. So the first thing to say is that 500 years of capitalism and white supremacy, you know, it's unfolding beginning from 1492, you know, with the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Iberia, the creation of, you know, really what Europe will eventually become, the papal bulls that turn white Christians into humans and the rest of humanity into commodities. All of those things, those chain of events, those create the modern world, those create the modern economy. They reached their apex in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century with British imperialism and French imperialism, and you had Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch before that. That mantle then gets passed to the United States of America, okay, after the Second World War. And the United States of America has directed since that time the most powerful and brutal white supremacist empire in human history, period, full stop. Okay. But the signs of its weakening grasp are also apparent. Its internal divisions are apparent. The wastefulness that inheres in capitalism as a system, the way that it must create racial categories and exploit people that actually have talents, right? Let me just go back, make this personal. I end up becoming, a historian of some small note, public intellectual of some small note, because I pursued a PhD, wrote some books, and I'm going to talk about the African resistance tradition in some of those books. But the reason why I went to college in the first place was because I could throw a baseball 90 miles an hour when I was 17 years old. I got into school on an athletic scholarship, and I was not the smartest kid in any of my neighborhoods growing up. Right? So we waste all of this incredible human potential and we concentrate all of this wealth at the top. And it is utterly collapsing, right? China outcompetes the US in everything because it's organized on different principles, even though it is implicated in capitalist systems. So all of this is to say that the signs of the imminent collapse of this empire are manifold. And one of the principal signs is the nakedness of the brutality. Is that as empires fall, they become increasingly brutal. I am absolutely convinced that what we are witnessing in the Zionist entity is the last gasp, choking on blood, the dying breath of Zionism. It often looks this way. People forget that the majority of Jews that were shoveled into gas chambers at Auschwitz, it was in the last few months of the Nazi regime, after all was already lost. White supremacist regimes often take as many lives as they can in human sacrifice when they're falling apart. So I do believe, objectively speaking, that we are witnessing the collapse. The mantle was passed. And it is very, very rare for, an imperium, I'm just going to keep things simple, for an imperium to last longer than 500 years. It's just rare in human history for that to happen. And I think that we see the signs of its collapse. Now, with respect to the second part of the question about our capacity to document this and to understand it and to see it, that's what the repression is all about. One of my favorite MCs, I told you hip hop was my first teacher. Poor Righteous Teachers, the great MC Wise Intelligent, once said, narrative scripts human behavior the way that code scripts computers. The stories that we tell create the reality that we inhabit and that we populate it and that we populate. The imperialists and the Zionists have lost control of the narrative. We are now able to communicate with one another without them as the intermediary, and we are able to craft these narratives. These narratives are not new, right? Kwame Ture, Malcolm X, James Baldwin, Angela Davis. I gave a litany of, I didn't even mention the Africans, right? Thomas Sankara, Nelson Mandela, Patrice Lumumba, all of the African, anti-Zionists. It's just that now we're able to circulate these pieces of information. We're able to pass news of the revolution to one another through circuits without control by those media outlets that we know are objectively lying to us and carrying water for empire. Last thing I want to say about that. There are like deep precedents, and my academic work talks about this, right? In chapter 3 of my first book, The Walking Quran, I tell the story of an African Muslim anti-slavery movement in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s that actually abolishes not only the slave trade, but the institution of slavery itself for a span of 36 years in the Senegal River Valley. We have auspicious examples from our own tradition of people who have struggled effectively against white supremacy. All we have to do is like mine our history, recover the things that drove and motivated that resistance, and apply them to our current moment. And we can be, the instruments for like the delivery of liberation. Empire, believe it or not, is actually crumbling under the weight of its own moral depravity. We just need to give it a push.
Professor, I'm going to change the area that we're speaking about just a little bit. I mean,
Sure.
it's not entirely. It's kind of tangential. I mean, obviously, in preparation for this, I came across a comment that was made by a user talking about you, and they say that one of your great skills is putting towards the complexity of multiple truths. Now, I want to say that because I want to speak about multiple truths. And
Yes.
the fact that within this moment of a lot of support for Palestine, there obviously are what a lot of support comes opportunism, and sometimes expressions of support that aren't very smart or wise or intelligent or just not right. So what you wrote on March 4th, and again, this was very soon after March 2nd, so the death toll is probably about the same, about 31,000 people. One of the things you wrote is, why can't people understand this? If you platform anti-black racists, you are participating in my oppression. You are saying it's okay to intensify the oppression of black people as long as it helps Palestinians. What is in the back of your mind when you wrote that?
At the front of my mind was Candace Owens.
Yes.
Was the fact that there's so many, and I just noticed it specifically amongst non-black Muslims. They started circulating all of these posts of Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson saying things, that seem to be supportive of Palestine. And there's a lot there. So the first thing to say is, if you've watched people who have made their careers off of anti-black racism, then you can't take these kind of statements seriously, right? Candace Owens said that George Floyd died from a fentanyl overdose and that the officers did nothing wrong. Candace Owens justified the murders of Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, Sandra Bland, every single black person killed by police violence. Candace Owens had an explanation to make white folks feel comfortable about it. So understand that, like, if you platform that kind of person, that is what you are platforming. You are legitimizing state violence against black people just for being black. And it leads to a secondary problem, which is one of the things that I'm most known for in the Muslim community before, October 7th, was being an absolutely relentless critic of anti-black racism in the Muslim community. And and somebody that can comment on its history from a standpoint that's informed by scholarship. So just to be clear about this, the Muslim community has a major anti-blackness problem that is, to a certain extent, being papered over by the solidarity that we are seeing in the pro-Palestine movement. But you see it surface from time to time when people try to insist that Sudan, and the genocide taking place in Sudan be brought to the forefront, that the genocide in Congo be brought to the forefront. You will literally see people in the pro-Palestine community, non-black people, like, try to tamp that conversation down. This is about us. Pay attention to this struggle. And the reason why I was framing things from the beginning in 2021 at Zionism as white supremacy is, if you understand Zionism as its founders did, as an iteration of white supremacy, then you realize we are all engaged in the same struggle. Indigenous people are engaged in one struggle. Palestinians are engaged in one struggle. Black people don't have a problem with the carceral state. We have a problem with white supremacy. Mexican Americans don't, and Central American people don't have a problem with U.S. immigration policy. We have a problem with white supremacy. If you understand and you read white supremacy as the common root of the common illness, then you're all standing together in the struggle against it. But if you think that this is about getting my people free, whether my people are Black people or Palestinians or indigenous people, then you have fallen for the divide and conquer technique. And inserting these loud anti-Black voices that have made a living facilitating the extra legal murder of Black people. Tucker Carlson literally said that Michael Vick should be given the death sentence for dogfighting. In 2008 or whenever it was. These are people that are literally painting targets on Black folks' backs. So when you platform them, you are betraying the movement because you are saying that I am going to prioritize the liberation of my people at the expense of yours. It's what Black folks call crabs in a barrel syndrome. Okay, the crabs in a barrel, in order to get out, they got to crawl on top of the other crabs that are on top of them, and they just keep doing it, and so nobody ever gets out of the barrel. And this is how colonialism works, by the way. It creates race, then governs you on the basis of race. And so then you even start to think of your capacity for resistance and bandwidth for resistance as operating within this silo. So it's like, no, pay attention to me. This is my moment. And what is it costing? It's costing the common solidarity. So it's actually not just historical. The reason why I'm trying to think that we frame things in terms of white supremacy, it's very much forward looking, because if we understand that the struggles that Black and brown people face, and that indeed that all colonized and oppressed people face, are the same. If we realize that white people that apostatize from white supremacy are our friends and not our enemies, I don't have a problem with white people. I got a problem with white supremacy. And many of the agents of white supremacy are Black and brown people like Candace Owens. So keep them off your airways and keep, essentially, all I will say about that is that it's incredibly costly to solidarity, and extremely short-sighted.
Okay. Again, this is on the theme of how on having a non-protracted noble solidarity. This you wrote on December 25th. At that point, 21,000 people in Gaza were killed, more than 8,000 children. This is the post. Palestinian liberation does not need Shaun King, but he should still never have been censored by Meta. He has been credibly accused multiple times, especially by Black women, of being an ambulance-chasing crisis profiteer. Some of us won't amplify him, but he should not be silenced. What's your response to that, or your thoughts to your own work?
Yeah. I mean, I remember, the late, great Rafat al-Hariri, being asked about, Shaun King, and he said, "You mean Talcum X?" I did, for the record, I did not call him Talcum X. That was our Palestinian liberation hero that was martyred that said that. So here's what I'll say. One, I've been proven right. Him being deplatformed had exactly no impact whatsoever on the salience of Palestinian liberation in social media spaces. I am somebody that has a deep aversion to white savior complexes, even when they are found amongst off-white people. Okay, I'm not going to get into the fact that Shaun King's birth certificate, says that he has two white parents. I don't think that that's significant to the conversation. As I said before, you don't have to be white to enact and reproduce the modalities of white supremacy. And one of the modalities of white supremacy is hero complexes and celebrity culture. People start to identify their resistance with a particular individual. Malcolm was my hero, but Malcolm was not the resistance. The resistance was framed, by all of these Black people struggling collectively together. Malcolm is somebody that understood the aspirations of the people, embodied them. He was not somebody that benefited personally from the people's energy and organization. And in fact, he refused, a lot of the things that, ministers in the nation were given before he eventually parted ways with the nation. I do not monetize anything at any time that has to do with our people's liberation, because I think it's unconscionable as a moral action. So the last thing that I think that I would say on this particular question is that a lot of us look to like comfortable, safe heroes that will do the thinking for us so that we don't have to do the hard work of interrogating our own positionality with respect to struggle. And that kind of figure is one that has been very, very safe for both white and non-white liberals. And my hero, I mentioned another one of them before, people more like Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney, grew up in Guyana, diaspora African, impoverished. He goes on to be one of the first people to get a PhD in African history, writes academic works, as well as things like How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which reaches a broader audience. Okay. He is assassinated by the government in Guyana for his organizing activity locally. He never stops his work as an activist just because he's an academic. And he writes in the beginning of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa that while he has been oppressed as a diaspora African, he has nonetheless experienced privilege with respect to some of his brothers and sisters still on the continent, and therefore he has a moral responsibility to throw his lot in with theirs in in a common struggle. That is a self-effacing approach, right? Not a self-aggrandizing approach. And my dad, God rest his soul, was a brilliant man, not an educated man, but a brilliant man. He said two things that I want to make sure get onto this tape. One will go back to Candace Owens, and then the second one will be on Shaun King. Regarding Candace Owens, my dad said, "You'll never go broke telling white folks what they want to hear." Okay, that's number one. And then number two, he said, the problem that we have, and pardon it, but he was part indigenous, so it's almost not racist the way that he said it. He said, too many chiefs, not enough Indians. Too many chiefs, not enough Indians. Everybody wants to be the center and center themselves in struggle. And that is one of the principal drawbacks of this social media activist environment, which I just want to add two things. I was very reticent to get involved with. I created a social media account after George Floyd was murdered because I felt that God would reproach me and punish me for withholding from as broad a public as possible anything that I had to offer that might have been of benefit. So I did that. But at the same time, I also started doing online spiritual intensives that are rooted in the West African Sufi tradition, about which I teach and I write, because that West African Sufi tradition is absolutely uncompromising in its focus on the jihad against the ego, the struggle against the lower soul, the struggle against self-aggrandizement, the struggle against centering yourself in everything. It brings together in an organic way spirituality and social justice, the struggle to bring out the best version of yourself and to carry out constant reckoning, right, of your own internal dynamics and the movements of your ego and the movements of your heart, so that those things do not become impediments in the struggle for human liberation. And when I try to tell people what I get from the Quran is the most radical document in human history for liberation from internal and external oppressors, and that liberation from internal oppressors is one of the principal things that I see lacking in the contemporary social media space. People that have been harmed by empire lash out in anger, or self-aggrandizement, or the illnesses in their own egos impose themselves in the way that they move in the space. And I'm certainly not free from having an ego, not free from having enough. But I have techniques that have been passed down for generations that allow me to at least try to stay focused on that which provides benefit to humanity rather than that which aggrandizes my own ego.
We're about to start speaking about what's happening on college campuses, and obviously you, as a member of faculty, your experience
Yep.
with that as well. But before that, just this, I think, is probably going to be the final Instagram post of yours that I read back to you. It's not related to what we're about to speak about, but I think it kind of foregrounds the conversation to some extent. It was posted on December 19th. At that point, the death toll in Gaza was around 20,000 people. And this is the post.
Can I say one thing just on that really
Please
quickly?
do.
Sorry to interrupt. The confirmed death toll,
The
right?
confirmed,
Because
absolutely.
that's where we can tether a name to a body. We have no idea what the actual scale is. And pardon
No. It's you're right.
The impudence in that statement.
No, you're absolutely correct, because I do think there's going to be so many more bodies found or not found and unknown once if the rubble ever gets cleared. So this is the post. Liberals need Palestinian resistance to be rooted in anti-Semitism. Otherwise, they will be confronted with the reality that they are white supremacists who have been standing by a genocidal colonial project all this time. Palestinian resistance and its supporters must be anti-Semitic so that liberals don't have to feel guilt or shame about maybe unwittingly supporting a decades-old ethnic cleansing project. They want their victims to carry their guilt and shame for them, on top of everything else. You have spoken to this already to some degree, but I mean, how do you think this foregrounds the what we're seeing on college campuses specifically?
Yeah. My first response to having all these Instagram posts read back to me is, man, I be throwing haymakers on Instagram. I don't usually read my own posts after I've posted them, but some of the stuff I'm like, dang, he said that. I was like, that's heat. So like I just said that I have techniques for controlling my own ego. I'll have to to implement some of those, because I was like, those sound good. Like that. So let me just say this. Yeah. So here's the basic issue. We're many of us perhaps familiar with the expression "scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds." Okay, and what's at the heart of that statement is that as soon as there is skin in the game, then you will see the true colors and of the liberal. And I go back to Malcolm again for this. Malcolm was the first one to warn me. He said that the white liberal and the white conservative are essentially the same. He said the white liberal is the fox, the white conservative is the wolf. They differ in the modality of the hunt. One does it through cunning and guile, the other does it through sheer brutality and outright force, but they are both trying to consume you. So I have never been one that accepted, sort of the basic, go backwards for this. I am not a liberal, either in the sense of the belonging to that political faction amongst Western societies, nor am I even a liberal insofar as I accept the basic principles and predicates of liberalism as a moral philosophy. I don't believe in the individual human being as the center of the universe. My moral philosophy is predicated on, the African ancestral traditions and the Quran, and I see those as fundamentally the same, So that's the first thing that I said. I've had a profound distrust of liberalism from the beginning. Now, if you understand liberalism in this way that Malcolm is framing for us, then you understand this expression, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. Because as soon as it costs something in terms of prestige, access, resources, or God forbid, blood, then they will become just as reactionary as the fascist. So they really actually have a deep-rooted psychological need for this imperialism not to collapse because it exposes their complicity in it from the beginning. Okay? So therefore, these campus expressions, they have to be about anti-Semitism because that means we're the good guys. And I said this in a class. I think I made an Instagram reel about this. I said this in a class this quarter, this past quarter for the first time. I had never heard myself say this. I said, listen, if you are a student at a North American university, you are essentially a trainee on the Death Star. Behave accordingly, right? What America does is point beams that destroy whole worlds. We are the Death Star. And it's hard for people who are on the inside of empire and whose sensibilities, taste, sense of self are so uh, tethered to the imperium to understand themselves as part of the problem. They're incapable of doing what Walter Rodney did, which is to say, yes, I might be a victim of the imperium, but I am also an agent of the imperium. And that produces a moral responsibility for me to help dismantle this oppressive institution. And liberals do not want to dismantle anything. They want more inclusion. They want a few more people of color to be in positions of power and authority so that they don't feel like they are explicitly racist and things can otherwise stay exactly as they are, because they're not really interrogating the extent to which things as they are resting on a pile of corpses that runs back 5 centuries, blood-soaked indigenous land, an Atlantic Ocean whose depths are filled with the bones of the enslaved. And that they don't want to confront that reality. And that's been part of the resistance to the idea of Zionism as white supremacy, is that as soon as you understand what it is, you realize, oh man, we've been writing blank checks for Israel for 75 years now. We are Derek Chauvin. We are the knee on the Palestinian neck, and they just don't want to face that.
You obviously are the deep expert in this, but in my own framing, I like to frame it as in you get white supremacists and you get liberal white supremacists. And white supremacists are interested in preserving their power at any cost, and like overtly. And a liberal white supremacist is concerned about maintaining their power, but they're more concerned about the story they tell at the end of all of that. So it's very important to them that while they were responsible for slavery, they can say, oh, but we also abolished it. And so now all's good and all's well, and it's water under the bridge.
So first of all, you're the expert because you said that much more clearly than I could have. And it allows me to go back to something in my academic work that I think is worth mentioning. In that same chapter, chapter 3 of the Walking Quran, I completely debunk, and I also do this in the Cambridge World History of Slavery, which is sitting there, volumes 3 and 4. So that anti-slavery movement that I mentioned earlier in the Senegal River Valley in the 1770s. So the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, a person called the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, who is essentially the tutor of William Wilberforce in all things abolition. He writes in the 1780s that an African Muslim, Abdul Qadir Khan, has done more for the causes of liberty, justice, humanity, and religion than all of the sovereigns of Europe by his abolition of slavery. So, and he said that he was inspired to start the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade on the example of this West African Muslim. So part of the reason why I think history is so significant and important is that it also debunks the pure nonsense, right? We should know that the people that are responsible for the largest forced migration in human history did not invent freedom. They like to claim it, but like it should sound ridiculous to our ears. And when you actually start to uncover, what the archives say, what the oral traditions say, European slave traders were furious that African Muslims abolished the slave trade and slavery. And many in that time said that Europeans were inspired by this African Muslim abolition. So all of that is just to say that liberals lie to themselves about all kinds of things, and they use history, right, and misuse history in order to perpetuate those lies. And this was also like the most radical part of what Malcolm was calling me to when he was calling me to history, was to expose through careful and rigorous research the house of cards on which all of these lies are founded. Like, it's standing on the most fragile of foundations. As soon as you actually start to, with an independent spirit rooted in your own tradition, as soon as you actually start doing the work, you can really dismantle a lot of these ideological structures that are used to keep white supremacist liberals, as you call them, comfortable.
I mean, I'm gonna ask you the question now about the students, but I want to continue this discussion that we're having right now. I mean, in many ways, the biggest fight that white liberal supremacists have are with white supremacists over the story. So to a large extent, you'll see, I mean, with the politics between blue and red in America, and in the UK between the Conservatives and the Labour Party, they fight over what they get to tell about how they oppress the immigrants and the minorities and how they manage to keep all the wealth. And that's the fight. It really is. If you look at the talk shows, if you look at what they're talking about, it's not about real empathy for the other. So I want your response on that, and then we're gonna speak about the protests.
I think that you said it just right. It's essentially it's an argument about which narrative of superiority will prevail.
Absolutely.
A narrative of civilizational superiority, which is the fascist right position, or a narrative of moral superiority, which is the liberal position. The one is predicated on we are better, we are smarter, we have more technology, everyone should be like us, and they should, and therefore when we tell them
and we have better ways.
Yes. And so when we tell them to submit to our way of doing things, then we are doing them a favor, right? It's good that we enslaved you because we taught you Christianity, okay? Whereas what the liberal position is to say, democracy, freedom, and we are giving these gifts to all of humanity. So our superiority is crafted in moral terms, right? And it's about the benefits of it being included in this, superior moral civilization. Never mind that it's pure nonsense, right? I mean, never mind that, like, there was literally one Greek city-state that had democracy, and it was Athens, okay? And in Athens, only the native-born male property owners were allowed to vote. And if only the native born are allowed to vote, that's what you call an ethno-state. So it was hardwired into the foundations, from the beginning. It has always been an exploitative exercise. But the liberal tradition, the liberal is practiced in nothing more than self-deception.
Okay, so now we will speak about the protest. Now, the question, and the reason why we had that big discussion, not only because I think it was valuable and it was really good to get your thoughts on it, but it's because the question I want to ask is, do you think that these protests are different? Precisely because the kids do disassociate, or maybe they don't, from this problem of liberalism being the fox?
It's an excellent question, and I'll draw on myself as an expert witness in a different way to answer it. So, been a professor for 20 years now, 20 years, okay? And when I started out, I taught at Northwestern University for 4 years, University of Michigan for 10 years, and now this is my 6th year at University of California, Santa Barbara. And I've been saying the same things about capitalism, about white supremacy, about the centrality of spirituality and meaningful struggle. I've been saying the same things for those 20 years. When I spoke about capitalism the way that I did 20 years ago, 10% of the students, heard me, because they were all convinced that their future, was gilded because of capitalism, right? Now, 60% of the students have checked out on capitalism altogether, because they've seen the 1%, concentrate all the wealth at the top. I don't know if you guys get the Wizard of Oz over there, but it used to come on annually every year. And the great and powerful Oz is projecting this image of power, and then Dorothy sees that it's just an old white man in a projector room, and he says, "Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain." Right? That's what's happened with capitalism, is that it's been revealed that it's this projection of big power, but there's weakness and fragility behind it. And there's actually no there. So the students have checked out on capitalism. The Black Lives Matter marches that we saw after 2020. Listen, I've been marching against apartheid and police brutality since I was a teenager, 14, 15 years old. These marches against police brutality after 2020 were the first time that Black people were ever outnumbered by non-Black people in any of the marches that I attended. Okay. And oftentimes we were outnumbered by a factor of 5 or 6 to 1. So there's been a sea change on, the way the carceral state, on police brutality, on some of the basic fundamentals of racial politics for that young generations. Okay, so capitalism, check. American racism, check. Although, we backslid since 2020 in certain ways. Palestine. When I talked about Palestinian liberation in these terms framed by the Black tradition in the early years of my career, people looked at me like I'm crazy. Maybe 2% of the student population could hear it, and they were usually either Palestinian or Muslim, okay? Now, that's also 60%. So why am I saying all this? As context, this generation has had the veil pulled back for them. They are not going back to a world where they imagine that capitalism, imperialism, racism, and Zionism are like acceptable. They are going to continue to fight. I have if we, as the generations ahead of them, provide cover for them and clear ground for them and do our jobs. And that's one of the reasons why October 21st, I literally organized a liberation concert on the UCSB campus. That was the thing that that and a talk at the local mosque about Black and Palestinian solidarity is what caused the local Zionist community to try to get me fired. And I should take that risk. It's our responsibility, right, to throw our bodies in front of this machine, to clear the way for these students, for these young people who are, they're going to have to live in this world after we're gone. That's one thing that I will say is that I think I have been disappointed thus far, not by the student response, but by the response of many of the adults in the room, right? That we're still, many of us are still clinging on to comfortable positions. We're still clinging to non-controversial points of view. We're still afraid, some of us, of the Zionist lobby. But the truth of the matter is that if we all speak out, they can't shut us all up. I really do believe that the effort to get me fired from UC Santa Barbara in October would have worked, except that there were so many people speaking at the same time that there just wasn't enough bandwidth, capacity, and resources to focus in on individual cases. Like Mark Lamont Hill, got fired from CNN for saying less than what I had said, and I think that's part of the moral obligation that comes with speaking, is that if we speak out, we provide cover for these young people to push things further in the way of freedom. And then my last reflection, I think, at this stage is that I really do actually believe that it's possible because I've seen it work, right? It looked as though the apartheid regime in South Africa was impregnable and could never be toppled when we were speaking out and marching and protesting and, making rap songs, about freedom in the late 80s. And then just like that, it was gone. The pressure to divest, produced such cost, frankly, for the apartheid regime that it was no longer sustainable. Just like that, it was gone. Never forget that it was, I'm going to say this, Nixon, in the modern history of the United States presidency, is probably the most reactionary right-wing fascist to sit in the Oval Office. And that is a statement of some distinction. We've had a lot of really, really, like accomplished reactionary fascists in the White House. We've got one there now. Nixon was perhaps the most reactionary of them. And Nixon himself was forced to withdraw from Vietnam. With like literally the devil himself, Kissinger riding shotgun for Nixon. Nixon forced to withdraw from Vietnam because of the pressure from students. And that is the reason why we are seeing this fascist pig crackdown, this police crackdown on campuses now, is that the war machine knows that student protest is effective. Student protest is not just, young people letting off steam. It is indicative of what the sensibilities of the next generation are going to be, and they are trying to silence that as much as possible. But there's an African proverb that says, "No fist is big enough to block out the sky." Like, the people will claim their freedom, but we as adults need to help young people claim freedom in this next generation.
How's that witch hunt, which occurred in October, to try to get you ousted? How's that going? Are you still under pressure?
So it's over and done with. What the chancellor of the university, to his credit, the same day that the next day after that came out, he released a statement called Principles of Community, where he affirmed that faculty members have the exact same rights to free speech that anybody in the society has. Which was a positive move, right? You didn't see that from Columbia and Penn and Harvard at that time. There has been a more recent unfortunate turn, which is the pressure from Zionist donors. This is not to me personally, but I'm talking about the UCSB community, that the UC system is now like making statements where they're making a policy where they're cracking down on department landing page political statements. They essentially, they don't want Zionist donors to get to a UCSB history department or Black Studies website and see Free Palestine on the landing page. So they're undertaking some efforts to quell free speech, but it's nothing like what you're seeing from the donor-driven private colleges. And I do want to say one thing about that. 20 years on campuses. I mean, I've watched the utter collapse of the North American university as it has become essentially training ground for capitalists, and they're basically corporate institutions now. Universities are. So I'm not surprised to see the outsized influence that the donor class is asserting in such absurd ways. Because the fiction that North American universities were like educational enterprises instead of capitalist labor pools has been, sort of peeled away over the last, 20 years, as students have been, increasingly drawn into debt, and arms dealers and arms manufacturers have started to drive STEM financing and STEM funding. Like, there really is, like, it's a powder keg that was long overdue for an explosion. It's just that Palestine lit the spark.
You mentioned adults in the room need to stand up, and maybe you had questions of whether they have stood up. Earlier on, you also spoke about LeBron James and some of his reactions to this immediately. What do you make of, very, very important figures who have massive standing in the community, people like Colin Kaepernick, LeBron James, who people rally around and have said important things? What have you made of their response to what's happening in Palestine? And why do you think that's their response? Like, what do you think is the sociological conditions that have given rise to this phenomena?
Well, so I'll ask a question in response to the question. I'm ignorant of what Kaepernick said or didn't say. So what did Kaepernick say?
I think that's the problem. I'm also ignorant of what he said or didn't say. And I think we normally would not have been ignorant of something Colin Kaepernick would said.
And we haven't heard from Trevor Noah. You know, like
Absolutely,
there are
yep.
people that have remained silent. Um, so LeBron James first. LeBron James is no different from Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan, said Republicans buy sneakers too, in the 1980s. When given the opportunity, to speak out against the North Carolina senatorial, openly, racist senatorial, candidate, Jordan declined. And when I saw LeBron's, stand with Israel, I was like, LeBron had his, Jordan moment. He's trying to be the equal of Jordan in all things. So, he wanted to mark his, legacy as one that was, selling out for, the powerful. And ultimately, that's what it's about. Is people have been conditioned to have fear of a powerful Zionist lobby, not just at the level of AIPAC, but at the level of the media, at the level of Hollywood. And so they are afraid to just stand up and speak the truth because they think that they are going to be made to pay for it later. I think that that's, sort of at the heart of it. I don't think anymore. Um, I don't think any, I'll put it this way. When I was talking about liberation 20 years ago, the way that most Americans, including Black Americans, read, um, you know, many didn't even know the word, Palestine, right? They just knew like conflict in the Middle East. And the way that it was framed was like, oh, well, this has always been going on. There's a timeless war between, Arabs and Jews, for the Holy Land. Um, I don't think that anybody has those illusions anymore, right? I think that this is now just purely a question of power, influence, and the corrupting effect that power and influence has on on human beings. They simply do not want to speak up because of the risks that are associated with speaking up. It might cost them money, and they like their money, so they prefer to not speak up. Or to offer, sort of calming platitudes or both sides. There's no both sides in a genocide. Can we just say one thing about this really quickly? This is as naked a genocide as we have ever seen. Like, it is as naked as the Herero genocide in German Southwest Africa. It is as naked as, the Trail of Tears. It is as naked as Auschwitz. It is as naked as any genocide, as naked as Bosnia. It is as naked as any genocide in history. And people are still trying to tell you that it is midnight at high noon, right? They're trying to.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
mean, naked and documented and recorded, and I think and live recorded, and so that really makes it unique. We're about to get to the final question, but I just want to kind of sober the conversation a little bit, right?
Sure.
So I've been a journalist for about 16 years, and despite massive pattern recognition with bias and everything else, initially, for that first 2 weeks after October 7th, I was viscerally hurt by the double standards in media. And I think all of us were, right? And so there's been a lot of hope that we've spoken about in the last 20 minutes about a new generation, the fact that the masks are off, we know what's going on, right? But in many ways, I mean, I think you just said previously, it's like we know now, we've seen it, and the narrative on this ancient conflict is no longer there, right? In many ways, what happened in Iraq was quite similar. For 2003, 2004, it didn't, like, the timeline was much longer. It didn't all happen in 6 months. But for 2 years, there was almost blanket support of what the US was doing within the USA, not the rest of the world, for a large time. And then in 2006, 7, maybe the dates are a bit fuzzy, but then you started having Colin Powell started admitting that, they mugged the intelligence. The New York Times started apologizing about how it covered everything and how it was beating the war drums. And so you had this moment of correction. I don't think it was correction, but you had like mild reflection, rather, right?
Really trying to save face and credibility, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But then there definitely wasn't a learning moment, because 18 years later, we're back at square one. It's worse, right? Like there's a good argument to be made that this coverage has been even worse precisely because the counter information is just so much more available, right? And I'm making that just to kind of like, it's like, maybe it's not what you're saying. Maybe it's maybe 20 years time or 30 years time, we're going to go through this again, maybe more frequently. What's your thoughts on that?
I'll go back to what Wise Intelligence said. Narrative scripts human behavior the way that code scripts computers. By reading and understanding the moment in a way that affirms our capacity to transform it, I am engaging in an intentional act of insurrection. By speaking and moving and acting in a way that is driven by the belief that freedom is promised, I am bringing freedom about. I'll say this. The Quran tells you that every empire falls. The end of Surah Maryam, one of my favorite chapters in the Quran, God says, have you not wandered through the earth and seen the ruins of those who were more exalted in power and might than you? Do you see any sight of them now, or hear so much as a peep? Pharaoh's pyramids are tourist attractions. The Roman Colosseum has no Roman emperor to put his thumb up or his thumb down. All empires fall. And one of the ways that empire prolongs its life, delays its inevitable demise, is by convincing its victims that it cannot be defeated. Freedom is there if we believe that freedom is within our grasp. But as soon as we persuade ourselves that the empire is going to strike back, then we start to limit our engagements. We start to make ourselves small. We start to calculate again on the basis of, oh, well, there could be repercussions if the Zionists come back to power. So therefore, I should be quiet now. Well, you've just defeated yourself. So my answer is, and this is going to sound optimistic, and if you follow me on Instagram, you know that I don't present as necessarily a particularly optimistic person. I try to balance hope and fear, right? Which is the way that the Quran teaches us to think of things, like hope in mercy and compassion, and fear of divine wrath. I actually do believe that we will produce the outcome through our understanding of it. That if we continue to develop a narrative that freedom is not only possible but inevitable, that the end of empire is not distant but near, right? Think about anti-colonial struggles in Africa. In the 1940s, they were talking about another 200 years of colonial rule, right? And by the mid-1960s, we at least had what Walter Rodney called flag independence, right? We at least had, independence. You now see throughout West Africa, in Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali, and now in Senegal, you see, the arrival of a generation that is very, aggressively anti-imperialist and is trying to cut ties with the former colony. So, our colonizer. All of that is really just to say that, yes, it is, of course, possible that, this will just be a moment of resistance, and that the empire will reassert its force. But we have a saying, in the Black community, is if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready. If you believe that the transformative revolution is going to find you, on your watch, then you're going to be preparing for it. And whether or not this is actually the last go-round that gets us free, you will have moved us closer to it. Frederick Douglass didn't get to see, the final results of his actions. Harriet Tubman said, I freed thousands of slaves, and I would have freed thousands more if they knew they were slaves. You have to first convince people that that freedom is possible for them and that it is their birthright, that it is something that God inscribed into their very nature. And then they will not rest until it is within their grasp.
Thanks. Final question. Just a comment, actually. And I think nowhere else is that being shown so powerfully as it is in Gaza right now. Just a reflection on that. And I think really this is why Israel is losing, or may lose, because the Palestinians are not giving up. They have nothing to fight with, but their existence is in itself it's their weapon. So yeah,
the Zionists have already lost. They just have refused to accept the inevitable reality that will come with a new dawn. It is already over. They have lost control of the narrative and they will never get it back. The entire world is against them. And if it were not for US missiles, that regime would have already collapsed. Gideon Levy said that as soon as the US withdraws its support, Israel will collapse within a month. And so this is also the reason why I'm saying we have to continue, because if we understand the organic relationship between these university protests and what actually happens to our brothers and sisters, not only in Islam, but in humanity, in Palestine, then we understand that on the day of judgment, like, we will literally be questioned not only about what we did, but what we left undone. Anything that we can contribute to the fight that might keep one missile from landing on one child in their sleep, right? So we can continue to leverage this pressure, because literally as soon as the US support is broken, as soon as Biden or whoever is in the office has the moment that Nixon had where the calculus turns, Israel is finished. Zionism as a political project is finished. There will be, at some point in our lifetimes, I'm now persuaded of this, freedom for all Palestinians between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. It is inevitable, but only if we do not desist. And in order to not desist, we have to actually believe in the possibility of victory. And our brothers and sisters in Palestine are showing us that that belief is not ill-founded or fantastical. It is rooted in the resilience of the human spirit.
How does America save itself, and can it?
I want to come back to that question, and I'll say this. So I made this on Instagram reel the other day. There's a time in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He's sitting with his companions, and they all hear this loud rattling sound, and everybody jumps, but the Prophet ﷺ sits still. Okay. And they asked him what that was. And he said, 70 years ago, a stone was thrown into the deepest pit of hell and it just now hit bottom. Now, there was a 70-year-old hypocrite on the other side of town, evil, wicked person, who had backbitten and slandered the messenger, peace be upon him, who had died at that very moment. Okay. Now, why am I saying this? 75 years ago, a stone was thrown into the deepest pit of hell and it's just now hitting bottom. That stone is Zionism. It's going to make a bunch of noise as it collapses, but its doom was always written. It was always inevitable. So now you might perhaps intuit my response to, can America save itself? America's doom was always written. No empire that was founded in so much bloodshed could ever be eternal or hope to be eternal. It's not possible, okay? And the only reason I'm convinced that America is still standing is because of the prayers of my enslaved ancestors who called out, as the people in the Quran called out and said, "Oh Lord, bring forth from my progeny a righteous people." And here we are. Here we are, righteous, standing 10 toes down. If America survives, it will not be as this empire, if America survives. And that choice is in America's hands entirely. It is in the hands of this generation. If we transform it, if we divest from the war machine and from imperialism, God might give us another go round, another generation, another 2 generations. But if we continue to extract every resource from students, from Black people, from brown people, from poor people, to lock them up, put them in prisons, and take every penny from their pockets to go bomb Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen and Israel, then God is for sure going to call it a wrap. It is not going to continue in that way interminably. All empires fall, and it is in our hands. You know, we're going to decide, how much noise it makes, and we're going to decide what replaces it. Right? We're going to decide whether a society that is committed to justice, to meeting human needs, to anti-imperialism replaces it, or just another iteration of capitalist exploitation with different people in charge, because we've seen that too.
Dr. Belal, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you. It's been really informative. Thank you, and have a good time.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to converse with you. So thank you again.